There are moments in life when everything begins to collapse at once. Doors that were open suddenly close. The people you depended on begin to drift away. Opportunities that once felt certain evaporate without explanation. And you stand there, staring at the empty space left behind, asking yourself the question no one ever teaches you how to handle: why is everything being taken from me so quickly? What most people never realize is this: when God removes things with unusual speed, it is never random. It is never punishment. It is never cruelty. It is a message, not the kind you hear with your ears, but the kind you can only understand when your entire life is forced to go silent. Because the truth is simple, but uncomfortable: when God needs to get your attention, He will not always wait for your cooperation. Sometimes He removes what you will not release. Sometimes He strips away what is slowly killing your purpose. And sometimes He pulls you out of a place you were never meant to settle in. But before He can reveal what He is doing, He allows the breaking to speak first. And that's why the first stage of this experience feels like chaos. Not because God is absent, but because everything that does not belong to your next season must fall away, and it must fall away fast. The longer it stays, the more damage it causes. The more it delays your growth. The more it blinds you from what God has been trying to show you all along. So He takes it. Quickly. Abruptly. Without warning. And that speed is the message. He removes the friendships that quietly drained you. He removes the relationship you kept idolizing. He removes the job that numbed your spirit. He removes the comfort that made you spiritually asleep. He removes the distractions you kept protecting. He removes the identity you built without Him. And while you're standing there confused, trying to make sense of the sudden emptiness, you fail to see what is actually happening beneath the surface. God is not collapsing your life, He is collapsing the illusion you built around it. Because you would not move. You would not let go. You would not listen. So He stepped in. Not to punish you, but to reroute you. To rescue you. To stop the slow spiritual death you did not notice. To break the pattern you were repeating. To pull you out of the path that would have destroyed you quietly. And here lies the truth most people never hear: God removes quickly when the danger is hidden. The faster the removal, the greater the threat. You don't see the conversations spoken behind your back. You don't see the intentions of people who smile in your face. You don't see the opportunities that were traps. You don't see the spiritual consequences of staying where you are. But God sees. And when He sees what you refuse to see, He acts. This is why sudden loss feels like betrayal, but it is protection. This is why sudden endings feel like abandonment, but it is alignment. This is why sudden collapse feels like destruction, but it is reconstruction. God removes fast because destiny cannot wait forever. And purpose cannot grow in contaminated soil. And calling cannot survive in environments that silence your spirit. So when the shaking begins, you must understand that the purpose is not to break you, the purpose is to break everything that is holding you back. Yet still, even with all this, the human heart is resistant. It fights the collapse. It tries to cling to what God is tearing away. It tries to rebuild what God has already dismantled. And that is why the pain intensifies, not because God is cruel, but because you keep trying to hold what He is trying to heal you from. There is always a moment, a specific, painful moment, when you finally realize that nothing you try will restore what God has removed. You can cry, fight, beg, negotiate, and bargain, but what God has taken, no human hand can return. And that realization becomes the doorway to understanding. This removal is not a sign that God is done with you, but that He is about to begin something new. The collapse is not the end. It is the clearing. And in this clearing, if you stay silent enough, still enough, honest enough, you will feel the truth rising inside you. God didn't remove to harm me. He removed to warn me. He removed to save me. He removed to redirect me before it was too late. This is the beginning. The moment you stop asking, why did I lose everything? And start asking, what is God protecting me from? And that question, that single shift, is where the next part of your transformation begins. When a person finally reaches the point where the question changes from, why did I lose everything, to, what is God protecting me from, something shifts in the unseen realm. Not because the situation has changed, but because the heart has. And that shift, that quiet internal surrender, is the crack in the wall where clarity begins to seep in. But clarity never arrives all at once. God reveals through stages, often beginning with silence. That silence is not meant to frustrate you, but to detox your spirit from the noise that kept you blind. Because truth requires space. And as long as you are surrounded by distractions, patterns, and people from your old season, you will misinterpret God's movements through the lens of fear instead of discernment. So the silence stretches. Your phone stops ringing. Your plans stop working. Your expectations collapse. Until there is nothing left to listen to except your own spirit, and even then, you resist it at first. Because stillness exposes what busyness was hiding, the truth you didn't want to face. The truth that something in your life had been dying slowly long before the collapse began. In this stage, God doesn't rush. He waits. He lets your spirit settle. He lets your illusions fall to the ground. He lets your excuses lose their power. And little by little, you begin to see that the removal was not sudden, the signs were there, but you ignored them. The discomfort. The exhaustion. The emotional heaviness. The constant spiritual conflict. The feeling that you were forcing something that should have been released. You tolerated what God had already rejected. You stayed where His presence had already departed. You tried to revive what He was trying to bury. And once you see this truth, the pain changes flavor. It's no longer the pain of loss, it becomes the pain of realization. And realization pain cuts deeper than loss, because it forces you to confront your own patterns, the conversations you shouldn't have entertained, the people you shouldn't have trusted, the comfort you shouldn't have chosen, the opportunities you shouldn't have accepted. But realization is healing disguised as discomfort. And that is the exact moment when God begins to reveal the second layer of His warning. You start seeing that every removal had timing. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't sudden. It was synchronized. The friend who drifted away right before their betrayal was revealed. The door that closed before it trapped you in a commitment you were not ready for. The relationship that ended before it consumed the rest of your identity. The job opportunity that vanished before it locked you into a path that killed your calling. Everything God removed, He removed on purpose. And everything He removed fast, He removed for protection. This is where the mind begins to breathe again. This is where the heart begins to soften again. This is where you start to sense, not with logic, but with spirit, that all of this was leading somewhere intentional. But God is not done. Because protection is only the first phase of sudden removal. The second phase is exposure. Not exposure of people, God doesn't need to humiliate anyone to protect you. But exposure of truth. Exposure of motive. Exposure of spiritual reality. The moment you begin to see the patterns you were blind to is the moment you realize that God didn't simply remove things, He revealed why they needed to be removed. You begin to recognize the emotional manipulation you tolerated. The spiritual heaviness you normalized. The stagnation you mistook for stability. The false peace you confused with comfort. And then something even more powerful happens. You recognize how much of your life was built on fear, fear of starting over, fear of losing people, fear of disappointing others, fear of being alone. And God, in His mercy, stripped away everything that fear was keeping alive. Because fear-based living will always lead you away from purpose. And God will never allow fear to write the story He authored. So He tore the pages you were clinging to. He closed the chapter you tried to stretch. He removed the characters who were never meant for the next part of your journey. And with that realization, something inside you awakens. You stop seeing the collapse as an attack. You start seeing it as alignment. You stop seeing the emptiness as loss. You start seeing it as preparation. You stop seeing the silence as abandonment. You start seeing it as instruction. This shift, this spiritual pivot, is the foundation for everything God will reveal next. Because the warning isn't simply that something was wrong. The warning is that something needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Your identity. Your boundaries. Your discernment. Your dependence on God instead of people. And as this awareness settles in, you begin to feel something unusual. A calmness that doesn't match your circumstances. A clarity that doesn't make sense logically. A spiritual grounding that you can't explain through emotion alone. This is the presence of God beginning to return to a life that finally made room for Him again. And just when you think you understand what He is doing, He reveals the third phase. The most uncomfortable one. The one that will redefine everything you thought you lost. And that is where the next part begins. The third phase of sudden removal is the one hardly anyone recognizes while they're living it. It feels the most painful, the most confusing, and the most spiritually intense. It is the phase where God stops protecting you from the truth and begins confronting you with it. Not the truth about others, that's easy. Not the truth about circumstances, that's predictable. But the truth about yourself. The parts you hide. The patterns you deny. The behaviors you justify. The wounds you pretend you've healed. This is the moment when God stops whispering and starts revealing. And these revelations rarely arrive softly. They come like flashes, quiet, but undeniable. You begin to see how your own choices kept you in cycles God was trying to break. How your attachments were built on insecurity. How you tolerated disrespect because you were afraid of being alone. How you silenced your own needs to keep connections that were already spiritually dead. It is uncomfortable to realize how often you blamed the enemy for situations you maintained through disobedience. It is uncomfortable to admit how many times God warned you, nudged you, unsettled you, and you ignored it because the truth didn't match your desires. But God can't build a new identity on top of self-deception. So He exposes the internal landscape you've been avoiding. This stage is not meant to shame you, it is meant to free you. Because the most dangerous lies are not the ones people tell you. They are the ones you tell yourself. You start recognizing the subtle compromises, the times you said, "It's not a big deal," the small boundaries you let slide, the moments you silenced your convictions to maintain peace that was never real. And the deeper you look, the clearer one truth becomes: the collapse around you began inwardly long before it showed up externally. Your spirit felt it. Your intuition sensed it. God signaled it. But you pushed it aside because comfort feels safer than clarity, until comfort becomes the cage. It is in this phase that God begins to strip away not just the external attachments that were harming you, but the internal ones. The need for validation. The fear of disappointing others. The fear of being misunderstood. The habit of seeking approval instead of alignment. The desire to control outcomes rather than trusting divine timing. And the more God exposes, the more you begin to see that some of the suffering you blamed on life was actually self-inflicted, not because you wanted pain, but because you lacked truth. Truth is not gentle. Truth breaks what lies protect. Truth forces you to confront the person you became while surviving. But underneath that painful confrontation lies something extraordinary: rebirth. Because God can only rebuild you with what is real. The fake confidence. The fake relationships. The fake stability. The fake peace. The fake "I'm okay." All of it must collapse before genuine transformation can take its place. This is why the third phase feels like a spiritual wilderness. Not because God abandoned you, but because He is rebuilding you away from the noise. And in this quiet rebuilding, you start hearing Him again. Not in dramatic ways. Not in emotional waves. Not in supernatural signs. But in clarity. In conviction. In correction. In the gentle alignment of your desires with His will. The same voice you said you couldn't hear anymore begins to echo inside you differently, sharper, clearer, steadier. This is where something powerful happens. You begin to distinguish between the voice of God and the voice of fear. Fear tells you to hold on. God tells you to let go. Fear tells you to fix. God tells you to surrender. Fear tells you it's over. God tells you it's beginning. And as this separation becomes clearer, you begin to understand why God had to remove things so suddenly. If He hadn't, you would have built your future on a foundation that could not sustain your calling. You would have stayed connected to people who were draining you. You would have continued chasing opportunities beneath your potential. You would have kept shaping your identity around versions of yourself that God was trying to deliver you from. Sudden removal is not just protection, it is acceleration. God doesn't remove quickly unless He plans to rebuild quickly. The collapse was the sign. The exposure is the confirmation. But the rebuilding, that is where the story begins to shift. Before God restores, He realigns. Before He promotes, He purifies. Before He opens new doors, He closes the ones that lead to destruction. And before He brings what is meant for you, He removes everything that would sabotage it. This phase teaches you one truth you will carry for the rest of your life. God's no is often the greatest expression of His love. And slowly, you begin to let go of the version of yourself that created the mess you're trying to escape. You release the identity built on survival. You release the attachments built on fear. You release the expectations built on insecurity. What emerges in its place is something stronger. A quieter strength, a deeper discernment, a sharper intuition, a more grounded identity. And just when you begin to embrace this shift, when you begin to understand the purpose behind the collapse, God introduces the fourth phase, the one that finally reveals where all of this has been leading. It's the phase where the shaking stops. The silence lightens. The confusion fades. And the first glimpse of destiny begins to break through the clouds. But that part is only beginning to unfold. There comes a moment in every spiritual collapse when the shaking finally slows. Not because everything is fixed, and not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because your spirit has stopped resisting what God is doing. The storm outside is the same, but the storm inside begins to quiet. And that shift, that quieting, is not accidental. It is the first sign that the fourth phase has begun, alignment. Alignment is not loud. It does not announce itself. It reveals itself gently, through a subtle change in your awareness. You wake up differently. You breathe differently. You see differently. Not because circumstances are better, but because you are. This is the phase where the internal fight dies, and a deeper acceptance starts to take root, not the kind of acceptance that comes from giving up, but the kind that comes from waking up. For the first time in a long time, you begin to understand that losing everything was not the end of your story, but the rearranging of it. The collapse was not a punishment, it was the realigning of your steps towards something you could not have reached in your old state of mind. In this phase, God doesn't hand you the full blueprint. He gives you awareness, small pieces of clarity that arrive like drops of water in a desert. You begin noticing the weight that has lifted since certain people left. You realize how much anxiety disappeared the moment a certain door closed. You recognize how your spirit feels lighter now that you are no longer forcing relationships, opportunities, or paths that were never truly yours. But the most powerful part of alignment is the shift in your discernment. You start feeling a difference inside your decisions. Before, you acted from fear, now, you act from wisdom. Before, you chased what looked good, now, you wait for what feels right. Before, you held on because you were afraid to lose, now, you release because you trust what God is doing. The removal taught you trust. The exposure taught you clarity. Now alignment teaches you surrender, not weakness, but spiritual maturity. This is where God begins introducing subtle confirmations. You feel guided in ways you never have before. conversations appear at the right time. A small idea keeps returning to your mind. A certain thought brings unusual peace. A verse hits differently. The voice of God becomes recognizable again because the noise that drowned him out is finally gone. And then something even deeper begins to happen. You start recognizing that everything you lost created space for what is being prepared. It becomes clear that the collapse made room. Room for growth. Room for identity. Room for direction. Room for people who actually align with the future God is building. You realize you spent years overcrowding your life with things that had no place in your destiny. Now, for the first time, your life has empty space, and that space is not loneliness, but preparation. But alignment is not just internal, it begins to manifest externally too. The opportunities you once chased start coming toward you. The clarity you begged for begins unfolding naturally. The emotional strength you thought you had lost returns stronger than before. The patterns that controlled you for years lose their grip. And here's the most surprising part. You no longer feel desperate to rush into the next chapter. You no longer feel pressured to prove anything. You no longer fear being alone with yourself. Because in alignment, you finally understand that God's timing is not late, it is deliberate. And every delay had purpose. Every ending had protection. Every removal had intention. Every silence had instruction. This phase is also where God starts revealing why he removed things so quickly. Not through dramatic signs, but through quiet truth. You begin seeing the consequences you avoided. The betrayal you escaped. The spiritual attacks you were shielded from. The emotional damage you were spared. The future pain that God cut off before it had the chance to take root. What once felt like loss starts to look like rescue. What once felt like emptiness starts to look like foundation. What once felt like abandonment starts to look like divine intervention. And slowly, you begin seeing your own reflection differently. You no longer see the broken version of yourself. You see the rebuilt one. The grounded one. The awakened one. The one who survived what was meant to destroy them. This is where identity begins to shift. Not the identity shaped by people. Not the identity shaped by your past. Not the identity shaped by your fears. But the identity shaped by purpose, the identity God has been trying to wake inside you all along. As this new identity strengthens, you feel something powerful. A rising sense of direction. Not the forced direction you used to chase, but a divine pull, a steady, unexplainable conviction that something is about to happen. Something new. Something significant. Something that requires the healed, aligned version of you, not the wounded version God removed from the old season. This is the most telling sign that alignment is complete. You no longer crave what God took away. You no longer chase what collapsed. You no longer mourn the doors that closed. You look forward, not backward. You feel expectation, not fear. You feel preparation, not panic. Because deep in your spirit, you sense that everything you went through was building toward something. The silence was training you. The removal was preparing you. The exposure was cleansing you. The alignment was positioning you. And right when you reach this inner stability, when your spirit is finally ready, God begins the next phase. The phase where he introduces what the collapse was making room for. The phase where the story shifts from warning to destiny. There comes a moment in the journey where God stops correcting softly and begins reshaping deeply. This is the moment when the soul realizes it was never just about hearing a message, God wanted transformation. And when a person refuses to listen for too long, the Lord doesn't send subtle whispers anymore, he sends a decision that changes the spiritual landscape. A decision that does not wait for convenience, comfort, or emotional readiness. It arrives like a doorway placed suddenly in front of you, demanding a response. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Now. And this moment, intense and unavoidable, becomes the turning point that defines one's destiny. In this stage, God is not trying to impress the heart, he is trying to awaken it. The difference is profound. When he awakens a soul, he touches the exact wound the person has been avoiding. He exposes the exact fear they refuse to confront. He confronts the exact comfort zone they used as a shield. The decision he sends forces the person to see what they were refusing to acknowledge, that spiritual numbness is not neutral, it is dangerous. Silence toward God is not peaceful, it is a sign of drifting. And the longer the drift, the more dramatic the rescue must be. This is why God often sends a decision wrapped in disruption. It feels sudden, urgent, even uncomfortable. But it is not punishment. It is rescue. It is God preventing a deeper fall. It is God pulling someone back before the cliff becomes impossible to return from. And this intervention is timed perfectly, not when the person wants it, but when heaven determines it is necessary. What many people fail to understand is that spiritual awakening rarely comes through ease. It comes through interruption. Because comfort puts a person to sleep, but disruption forces clarity. When God sends his decisive moment, everything that once felt stable begins to shake, not to destroy, but to reveal. And the individual realizes that God is not asking for a simple adjustment, he is demanding surrender. Not half surrender, not emotional surrender, not temporary surrender. Full surrender. The kind that rewrites the entire focus of life. In this decisive season, God amplifies the internal conflict. The person begins to feel torn between what they always held on to and what God is clearly calling them to let go of. They feel divided between familiarity and destiny. They sense the weight of the moment. They recognize that this is not an ordinary choice, it is a spiritual crossroad. And at this crossroad, neutrality is impossible. The soul must choose. Heaven watches. Hell trembles. And the heart, once asleep, realizes the magnitude of the moment. God's decision for someone in this state is often something that pushes them out of isolation. When a person is not listening anymore, God sends a situation that forces interaction. A circumstance that requires humility. A door that requires courage. A change that requires obedience. This is because isolation breeds deception, but movement creates revelation. And God will not allow a person to remain confined in a mental or emotional space that is quietly destroying their purpose. This is the moment where divine pressure becomes a gift. What looks like a crisis is actually clarity. What feels like loss is actually direction. And what feels like an ending is actually the beginning of alignment. The soul senses that something is being removed, not because God is taking something good, but because he is clearing space for what was always promised. In this phase, the person experiences a spiritual shift, the awareness that they cannot continue living on autopilot. They cannot continue repeating the same patterns. They cannot continue pretending that everything is fine while their spirit is starving. God's decision becomes the wake-up call that shakes the foundations of their complacency. And once the shaking starts, something powerful happens, the person begins to listen again. Not because things are easy, but because the weight of destiny is finally undeniable. And this renewed listening opens the way for transformation. The individual begins to understand that God's interruption was mercy. That the pressure was protection. That the forced decision was divine strategy. They begin to see that God always breaks what is false to reveal what is true. And the closer they get to obedience, the clearer their path becomes. In this decisive turning point, they realize something profound: God never sends a life-altering decision to destroy someone. He sends it to restore them. And every challenge that comes with it is not a barrier but a bridge. A bridge leading them out of numbness and into purpose. Out of silence and into clarity. Out of distance and into communion. The person discovers that when God breaks through the hardened atmosphere around the heart, he is not seeking perfection, he is seeking attention. Not flawless devotion, just willingness. And the moment willingness returns, heaven begins aligning what seemed impossible. Doors shift. Thoughts change. Strength rises. And the soul that once ignored the voice of God now begins to crave it. Because this is the truth, when God sends one decisive moment into a life that has stopped listening, it is not random. It is not accidental. It is not casual. It is the divine declaration that the season of spiritual sleep is over. There comes a point, after God sends the decisive moment, where the soul begins to feel the weight of what silence toward him had caused. It is not guilt, guilt crushes. It is awareness, awareness liberates. And in this awakening, God starts rearranging the interior world of the person so that the decision he sent can take root. This is where the transformation truly begins, not in the external changes, but in the deep restructuring of thought, desire, and purpose. It is the inside that God reaches first, because the inside determines destiny. The person begins to notice a shift. They are not running from conviction anymore. Something inside them is finally turning toward God instead of away from Him. They may not have all the answers. They may not feel fully strong yet. But the resistance that once blocked the voice of God starts losing power. This softening is not emotional, it is spiritual. It is the quiet returning of the heart to its true owner. And God sees it as the signal He was waiting for. This is when God begins revealing the meaning behind the decisive moment. He never explains everything at once. He explains in stages, so the heart can absorb the truth without collapsing. And the first thing He reveals is that His interruption was not meant to shame, it was meant to realign. The person sees that God stepped in because He refused to let them walk into a future that was never meant for them. This realization brings a mixture of humility and gratitude, because now, what once felt like disruption begins to look like protection. In this phase, God also begins to expose the small compromises that were weakening the person's spiritual hearing. Not to condemn them, but to free them. He shows them where their focus drifted. Where distractions took root. Where fear disguised itself as logic. Where comfort disguised itself as peace. It becomes clear that the silence toward God was never neutral. It was a slow erosion of clarity. And now, in this awakening, God is rebuilding the foundation. The rebuilding process is not harsh. It is steady, patient, precise. God removes what is harmful and restores what is essential. He strengthens the areas the person ignored. He brings clarity to thoughts that were confused. He restores disciplines that were abandoned. And little by little, the spiritual numbness fades. The heart that once resisted begins to desire His presence again. It is the beautiful return of sensitivity, a gift only God can give. And then something powerful happens, the person begins to sense direction. What was blurry becomes sharper. What was confusing becomes simpler. It is not that every answer arrives immediately, it is that the person can hear God again. And that hearing becomes the compass. God guides them through whispers, impressions, convictions, and subtle movements of the heart. This is the evidence that the decisive moment worked. The silence is broken. The relationship is reconnected. But with renewed hearing comes responsibility. God begins presenting choices that require courage. Choices that demand letting go of habits, environments, or relationships that were contributing to the numbness. Not because these things were always evil, but because they were misaligned. And misalignment, over time, becomes a slow spiritual suffocation. God will not allow that suffocation to return. So He calls the person to step into obedience, not emotional obedience, not convenience-based obedience, but sacrificial obedience. This is where many people hesitate, because surrender feels costly. Yet what they discover is that the cost of obedience is nothing compared to the cost of disobedience. Obedience liberates. Disobedience drains. Obedience aligns. Disobedience confuses. And once the person steps into obedience, even if trembling, something shifts, the weight on their spirit begins to lift. Clarity increases. Peace begins to return, not the passive peace of comfort, but the active peace of alignment with God. As this transformation deepens, the person begins to understand another truth: God never restores someone only for them to return to who they once were. He restores them to become who they were always meant to be. So he begins shaping identity. He removes false narratives. He breaks internal lies. He heals memories. He strengthens convictions. He awakens spiritual authority. This internal awakening becomes the beginning of a new life, not a slightly improved version of the old life, but a completely redefined one. This is also the phase where God begins shifting the person's perspective on their own destiny. They begin to see that the decisive moment was not just about correction. It was about calling. God didn't interrupt them only to stop them from drifting, He interrupted them to redirect them toward purpose. And the more they walk in obedience, the more they sense that purpose rising inside them. A fire begins to form. A hunger for meaning. A desire to live intentionally. A longing to walk closely with God, not out of fear, but out of love. And slowly, they realize that the moment that once felt like the end of their stability was actually the beginning of their clarity. What once felt like pressure now feels like direction. What once felt heavy now feels hopeful. Because the soul that hears God clearly is a soul that walks confidently. The fear of the unknown fades, because the one guiding them is known. The uncertainty of the future weakens, because the one holding it is trustworthy. And at this point in the journey, the person finally understands, the decisive moment God sent was not only to wake them up, it was to rebuild them. Not only to get their attention, it was to reposition their life. And now that they are listening again, what comes next is not random. It is divine design. It is the unfolding of destiny. It is the beginning of alignment between heaven's plan and their path. As the journey reaches its final stretch, something profound takes shape within the person who finally began listening again. It is not simply that they hear God more clearly, it is that they now respond differently. Their reactions are not impulsive but intentional. Their decisions are not emotional but aligned. Their posture is no longer defensive, but surrendered. This is the evidence of a heart that has been reconnected to its true source. And now, God begins revealing the deeper layers of why He sent that decisive moment into their life. The person starts to recognize that God was not trying to interrupt their plans, He was trying to protect their purpose. What they once saw as an obstacle now looks like a rescue. What felt like loss now resembles preservation. God was not removing them from something good, He was pulling them away from something that would have silently destroyed them. And now, with this clarity, gratitude begins to rise, not the fragile gratitude that comes from temporary relief, but the solid gratitude that comes from revelation. This revelation builds a new kind of strength, one that does not depend on external circumstances but on internal alignment. The person realizes that the greatest danger was never the challenges around them, it was the distance that had grown inside them between their soul and God's voice. That distance created confusion. That confusion created missteps. And those missteps created pain. But now, the distance has closed. The voice is heard again. And the path, once foggy, becomes illuminated. In this final stage, God begins teaching the person how to walk with Him consistently, not in cycles of intensity followed by silence, but in steady, daily pursuit. This is where the person learns that consistency is the true mark of maturity. Anyone can seek God when they are desperate. Anyone can cry out when everything falls apart. But the true transformation happens when a person seeks God even when things are stable, even when things are peaceful, even when they feel strong. Because consistency means the relationship is no longer based on crisis, it is based on covenant. And from that consistency comes authority. Authority is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is the quiet confidence of someone who knows who leads them. It is the spiritual certainty that comes when the soul is anchored. The person begins to walk differently, not arrogantly, but purposefully. Their decisions become sharper. Their boundaries become stronger. Their vision becomes clearer. They are no longer driven by impulse or fear, they are driven by direction. God begins to reveal future steps, not all at once, but in the right measure. Each instruction carries weight. Each whisper carries purpose. And because the person is listening now, each step they take aligns them more deeply with their calling. This alignment produces a chain reaction in their life. Distractions lose influence, relationships are filtered, desires are purified, and the fear that once ruled them begins to lose its grip entirely. In this phase, the person also learns one of the most powerful truths: God does not call anyone to return to who they were before they drifted, He calls them to become someone entirely new. The decisive moment was never about restoring the old version of them. It was about awakening the version that was buried beneath layers of noise, fear, pride, distraction, and numbness. Now, that buried identity begins to rise. Not a fragile identity built on emotions, but a solid identity built on obedience and clarity. And as this identity emerges, so does purpose. The person begins to understand why the delay happened. Why the doors closed. Why the silence was allowed. Why the decisive moment had to come. Every piece fits into a greater design. Every interruption becomes meaningful. Every disappointment becomes instructional. Nothing was wasted. God used it all, every confusion, every mistake, every quiet season, to shape them into someone who can walk in destiny without collapsing under its weight. This realization ignites a new fire inside them. A fire not rooted in excitement but in conviction. They no longer want to return to the life where they ignored the voice of God. They no longer want to drift into numbness. They no longer want to make decisions alone. They crave alignment, not because they fear punishment, but because they tasted clarity and refuse to return to confusion. This is the transformation God intended from the beginning. And now, after the decisive moment has done its work, the person stands at the threshold of a new chapter. They are not the same. They cannot be the same. They see differently, think differently, choose differently, and move differently. And God, who once had to shake them awake, now walks with them step by step, because they finally learned to listen. This is the final truth. God does not send a decisive moment to break you. He sends it to make you capable of hearing the direction that leads to the life you were designed for. And now that you are listening, everything in your story can change.